And again, today is the second Sunday in Advent. And Advent just means arrival, and it's the season that precedes Christmas in the church year that leads us to that place of knowing that God has come. Not me? Somebody else? Oh, okay. Thought I did something wrong. Wouldn't be the first time. And it won't be the last. It is that season of preparation of Christ's arrival. And it's also a reminder to you that we look forward to the second coming, that Christ will come again as promised. And so we are in this in-between season of his first coming and his second. But during this Advent season, we are looking at the story of the incarnation and what it means for us, particularly as being missional people who share in the same mission as Jesus did. Now, we have different roles to play, of course, in that mission, but Jesus was sent by God, and we focused on that last week as an important element of understanding, again, that God had a plan and a purpose all along, and that was Jesus. From the very beginning of the fall, when there was separation between man and God, Jesus was on the mind of God and was the plan of God. And we just carry on that mission as Christians, whether you know it or not, whether you like it or not. We're all called to carry on this mission of God. And so, again, we're using this season of Advent and particularly the incarnation of Jesus as a model for what it means for us to be missional people and to be missional lives. Last week we looked at leaving. The first important step is to get out. Jesus had to leave heaven to come to earth. He had to leave his glorified self to take on human flesh. And that's what incarnation means, to embody, to take on flesh. We need to leave our Christian bubbles, and we need to leave our comfort zones, and we need to leave our homes and some things as well in order to live as missionaries. Today we're going to look at what it means to live among as Jesus did. And so last week was leaving. This week is living. And we're going to be using John 1 again as our jumping off point. So turn with me to John chapter 1, beginning at verse 10. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Last week we learned that every gospel has a beginning. Every gospel, which is the story of Jesus, has the beginning of the story, and each of those gospels begins in a different place. John's gospel begins where? The beginning. Very good. John's gospel begins in the beginning. He says that. And the beginning means Genesis. It means all the way back before in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning was the Word. And so it takes us back to that very essence that even before time, even before creation, Jesus existed. We know that he is that Logos. He is that Word. And the good news is that Word who was with God, that Word who is God. In John 14, we hear that Word became flesh, right? And so we focused a little bit on the flesh part last week. This week, I want us to focus on that second part. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And that word dwelling really is, in the root, has two meanings. And the term means tabernacle. Okay, so a lot of times we focus, it means the Word became flesh and tabernacled amongst us. Now, you might be familiar with the word tabernacle. We see that in the Old Testament, right? The tabernacle is the place that God, that tent of meeting that God erects or has the Israelites erect in the wilderness as they are leaving Egypt before they enter into the promised land. The tabernacle represents the place of God's dwelling. And that's what that word means. And it's why it's translated from the Greek as made his dwelling amongst us. But the theological idea behind it is that God resided, he made his dwelling in the tabernacle during this time in the wilderness. That's where if you wanted to find God, if you wanted to meet with God, if you wanted to take up an issue with God, usually God took up an issue with you, by the way, just fair warning. If you're like me and you have your list of questions for God, Bad idea. Get rid of them. Get rid of them now. But it was the place where God would meet. It's where Moses would have these conversations, if you will, with God. It was called the tent of meeting. Well, if you fast forward several hundred years, you get to the era of David. And David has it on his mind that, you know what, he lives in this luxurious palace. God needs a home. God needs a dwelling place that could represent his glory. But God didn't tell David to do that. So God says, you're not going to build it. Solomon is. And so Solomon builds this beautiful temple. And the temple becomes the place where God takes up residence. And the temple has different parts. And we're not going to get into all of that. But in the most holy place, that's where God could be found. That's where people met with God. It was the place, that intersection between heaven and earth. Now, we also know, if you know the story of Israel, that several hundred years later, in 586 BC, that temple was destroyed. And that was a devastating event for the Jews. Because to them, again, God's presence is in the temple. If the temple is gone, what does that imply? God's gone. That there's no longer this place. God is not with you anymore. Right? That's a scary place to be. And they recognize that. So when they come back from captivity, they begin to rebuild this temple. And they build kind of it's a shabby little temple, but it gets by until Herod comes along and builds this grand, beautiful temple, which part of the base is still standing today. And again, this is, for the Jews, this was the center of their life. Well, then this carpenter from Galilee shows up, in about 30 AD, and he says, what? Tear down this temple, destroy this temple, and I will raise it up in 3 days. And people are like, and here's the ironic part, right? Rome actually destroyed the temple of Herod in, 70 AD? And again, it was so well built and so magnificent that they actually could not destroy the whole thing. They couldn't tear it down to the ground. Again, many parts are still, 2/3 of it is still in existence today. It was an engineering marvel. So when Jesus shows up and says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll rebuild it, people are like, you're nuts. But what was he talking about? Himself. So we moved from tabernacle being this tent in the wilderness to this temple that was at the center of the worship capital of Israel called Jerusalem, to now the person of Jesus. And so John, again, is leading us in this path, this theological idea that Jesus now becomes the place of God's residence. That it's the place, Jesus is the place where heaven meets earth. And that's usually what we focus on when we talk about Jesus being the temple, Jesus tabernacling or dwelling amongst us. But there's a second part of this that I want us to focus on today, and that's really more of the practical side of things. The fact that Jesus dwelt among us, that really, literally, he took up residence among us. And that's what I want us to focus on, because it's what we can relate to. It's what we can take from Jesus. What does it mean that Jesus took up residence amongst us? Well, on your notes there, and you can follow along too, it says to live among means that Jesus was first intentional. It means he was intentional. It means he had a plan. He had a purpose. Jesus understood his mission, that he was to go wherever God led him, wherever God called him, wherever God willed. That's where Jesus went. He says, I have come, last week we looked at this, I have come to do the will of my Father. What was God's will? Jesus said in Luke 19, the Son of Man came to do what? To seek and to save the lost. That was his mission, and he was intentional about it. So in order to seek and save the lost, and by the way, what does it mean to be lost? It's always important when we talk about lostness. I think sometimes we think of, as other people as being lost. Well, lost simply means that you're not where you belong, okay? When Jesus says, I have come to seek and to save the lost, he's coming to seek those people who are not where they belong, which includes all of us. We're not where we belong. This earth is not our home, right? We belong with Jesus. We belong in heaven. We belong in the paradise that God created for us. So Jesus came to bring us back to that place. He sought us out in order to bring us back into that relationship with God. It also means that Jesus was accessible. See, he came to seek people, but he was also accessible to those who might seek him out. In Matthew 19, we have the story of the children that are coming to Jesus. Jesus has these huge crowds following, and the children are trying to get to him. And the people, his disciples, are keeping the children away, saying, don't bother him. See, children were not like, we think a lot of children today. I mean, mostly. It's like we organize our lives around them in many ways as parents, right? Most of the time. I mean, they can be annoying when they're not your kids, but, I'm just teasing. Not Charlie, clearly. Charlie's adorable. He really is. But, your whole life does center around that kid. I mean, you can't just leave them behind and go on vacation for 2 weeks. That's part of it. That's part of the deal. Is that new to you, Vanessa? Oh, I'm sorry. But that's why you have grandparents, right? You've got to get them to soccer and scouts and dancing and all those other things, and they can become the center of your world. And, the children back then, it was like, we had you, so we had more help on the farm, all right? or to build the family business type thing. So children were kind of kept aside, but Jesus said, what? No, let the children come to me. He was accessible to the least of these, including the children. It also means that Jesus was knowable. We're going to talk a little bit about this at the end, but to be knowable means, again, that you're vulnerable, that you're opening yourself up to other people. Several of us are in a class on, it's a spiritual formation class that's running through the year. And yesterday we were actually at Good Shepherd in Irvine, and one of the things they talked about in that class was this idea of being known. That Jesus was known. He grew up and he spent most of his time, most of his teaching, and his ministry and his living years were all in small towns. Anybody from a small town? A couple of you? Yeah. What's it about a small town? Everybody knows everybody. Everybody knows your business, right? They know the good things you've done. They know the bad things you've done. And that's a revelation for people sometimes, to understand that Jesus was known, right? And we see it, even as a matter of fact, that as he begins to do these wonderful things and make these statements of grandeur, people ask. It says right there in Matthew 13, isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary? And aren't his brothers James and Joseph, Simon, and Judas? It's like, wait a minute. What are they saying there? They're saying, we know you. We know who you are. We know your history. We know where you come from. And so they knew him well. And that was part of his humiliation, his vulnerability to be known by other people. He was also very relatable, right? What's the first miracle Jesus performed? Turning water into wine, right? What was Jesus accused of all the time? Being hanging out with tax collectors and sinners and being a drunkard. I mean, he even says it himself, the Son of Man came eating and drinking. And you say, and he's speaking to the Pharisees here, you say, here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Jesus was relatable to people. He was able to be with them. And yet we also know that he was without sin. So he wasn't coming in this, with this posture of judgment or, being holier than thou. Think about that for a second. Who is one person who's ever lived who could actually take that posture? Jesus, right? Again, we have tendency, I'll speak for myself. I have tendencies of self-righteousness, of being holier than thou, right? But I don't have a leg to stand on there. Jesus actually does. He does, but he doesn't do it. He was relatable. He was able to be with people and to be normal. To be able to participate in a party, in a wedding feast, to go to somebody's home and to accept them and to eat with them and to share life with them. The last one is that he is reflectable. If you've Googled the word already, it is not a real word, okay? It doesn't exist, reflectable. But I had to have some word that fit there, right? So I made one up, reflectable. John 1:14 again, the second part, he says, we have seen his glory. And it's not just Jesus' glory, it's the glory of the one and only, speaking of Yahweh, speaking of the Lord, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Jesus reflected God's glory, and God's glory means his splendor, his brightness. Usually, when you're talking about a person, it has to do with how they appear to other people. And again, we've heard these stories before in the Old Testament that when God appeared to Moses, not only is God shining so bright, but when Moses comes down from the mountain, he has to wear a veil over his face because he is reflecting the brightness, the splendor, the glory of God. And it's too much for the people. Jesus similarly comes and he is reflecting God's glory. It has this idea that he is replicating the character of the Father. He's reflecting the character of God. And again, in the Old Testament, when we talk about the glory of God, it's not just what he looks like, it's also his character. It's his goodness, it's his grace. It's sometimes his power, how he reveals himself. But there's an interesting element here in Exodus 34 as he's giving the commandments to Moses. In Exodus 34, it says that God appeared before Moses. I'm going to read it for you. It's not on your notes, or it's in your notes, but it's not on the screen there. It says, "The Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord." And the Lord means Yahweh, by the way. His name is Yahweh. "And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness." This is how God revealed himself. It's how God described himself. It's what God thinks of himself. He says things like, he is compassionate, he is gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. And those words are important, love and faithfulness. Love is the word in Hebrew hesed, which is steadfast love, which is choosing love. It's a word often transcribed to the Greek to be the same word we use for grace. So hesed is grace. The word there for faithfulness is emet. And emet is more than just faithfulness. It's trustworthiness, it's dependability, it's truth. So when you hear God describe himself here to Moses as full of love and faithfulness, it's the same as him saying full of grace and truth. So when John says Jesus came full of grace and truth, it's every Jew is going to know exactly what he's talking about. He's basically describing Jesus in the exact same terms that God describes himself, that he's full of love and faithfulness. The bottom line is this: when you saw Jesus, and Jesus made this known to the disciples too, when you saw Jesus, you saw the Father. When you heard Jesus, you heard the Father. When you experienced Jesus, you experienced the Father. So what does this have to do with us? What about us? Well, again, living among, as Jesus did, requires and means that we participate in the natural activities of our culture, of our world, right? All the things that are just part of our life. It's living life among the same people in the same way that Jesus would. Think of yourself, who would Jesus hang out with? Tax collectors and sinners. Mike and I were talking about this before the service today. That's right. It's that great truth that anytime Jesus had a harsh word, who were the harsh words directed at? The religious people. Who are the religious people? We are. Right? It's a hard reality to accept sometimes. Like, ooh, yeah, Jesus is going to hang out with, the other people. That's what we've been talking about forever here, right? It's like, this is why we need to go out into the world. These are the people. Where would Jesus go? Who would he hang out with? Who would he spend time with? Again, keep in mind, Jesus was able to guard himself to enter into that world without being sinful. And that's a challenge for us too. Sometimes we do have to go to these places and again, if people are drinking, we have to understand like, hey, this is not something we can maybe partake, but we have to be careful and we have to know our limits and we can't go to excess. And we have to stay grounded in our identity as God's ambassadors, just as Jesus did. But we go to these places. It's what it means to live as a missionary. Jesus told us in Matthew, we're close, so I call him Matt. In Matthew 5:13, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven." In order to be salt and light, we have to live in close proximity with people, with our neighbors, with the people we work with, the people we spend time with. We have to be among them as Jesus did. And so we follow that same pattern. We have to be intentional. And again, it's easy for us. We talked a little bit about this last week. Sometimes as Christians, our attitude is to retreat from the world. And instead, we need to be in the world. But as the Bible says, not of the world. We have to be intentional. We have a plan and a purpose to invest in our community. I've got friends even that are now choosing, they've moved cross country and they've bought homes close together to establish little communities, little neighborhoods where, again, they are salt and light in that neighborhood. I know the Paynes and the Logues live right next, close to each other. It's a couple houses apart. While that wasn't intentional from the beginning, it can become intentional. It became intentional with their work in summer harvest and other things. Sometimes it's just, again, that intentional neighboring, being a good neighbor to those around us. The second part is, just as Jesus was accessible, we have to be accessible. We have to be available to people. That sometimes means that we have to, be uninterruptible. Like I shared last week, the knock on the door, it's like it causes me anxiety. Because it's like, who's interrupting my day? Who's interrupting my nap? Who's interrupting my football game? Whatever it is. Occasionally work. But who's interrupting me? And it's like, no, we have to create that margin where we're interruptible so we can be accessible to those in need. We have to be knowable. That means we have to be vulnerable. We have to be willing to share our lives, share our failures. That, we don't project. And many of us grew up in places and in households and times where we had to project a certain ideal, right? It's the arguing and fighting all the way to church and then get out and it's like, put a smile on your face. We're going to project as being this perfect family. That's right. That was not just my mom. My wife does that to me every time I leave the house on Sunday morning. Yeah, we don't project, we could be honest, we could be authentic, we could be real. We can, sometimes we can admit our mistakes, but we have to own up to them as well. We have to be accountable to our mistakes. We need to be relatable. And again, this is, I don't mean to offend anybody, but can we just be normal? Like, can you just be a normal person? Like, not everything has to be overly spiritualized and hyper-spiritualized. I'm sorry. I mean, I don't know I'm going to dig myself a hole. But just, be a likable person. Be a good neighbor. Be generous. Be fun to be around. Okay? I mean, that's what Jesus was. Again, he's Jesus. And yet when he's hanging out with these sinners and these drunkards and prostitutes, you name it, there was no judgment there. He could be, the light in the darkness. He can reflect God's glory and bring the kingdom of God to those dark places. But he transformed them, not the other way around, right? And part of that is sometimes we distance ourselves. We keep an arm's length. We need to just be good people, be fun people. We'll talk about this more next week. Ask them about their lives instead before you start preaching or telling them all about yours. Like, this is like basic dating 101 stuff, all right? Just be a good, normal human being if you can. Don't have an agenda with them. Again, we might have a plan to say, we want to spread the gospel. We want to proclaim the light, but we're not responsible for conversion. We're responsible for proclaiming. And so we can proclaim that, again, without having an agenda. And finally, we're reflectable, right? Just as we start to do these things, as we're being good people, if we just follow this, if we talk of God, love like God, serve like God, and maybe we should reverse that. Serve like God, love like God, so that you can talk of God. When you do those things, then you will be reflectable. You will be reflecting the character of God, his goodness, his grace, his truth to people. You will become that picture of God for your neighbor. I'm going to conclude with a video today. It's about a 6-minute segment, and it's from a video that was part of our spiritual formation class that a few of us are in, and it's called Godspeed. And it's the story of an American pastor or priest. He's an Anglican priest who ended up moving to Scotland while he was in seminary as part of his training. And so it's just a little segment from that video, and I encourage you, by the way, the link is on your notes there. It's on the notes online as well. If you want to watch, the whole video is about 35 minutes. It's not very long. But it's a great video, and it really kind of transforms, I think, a lot of what we think about. And he's speaking from a pastor's perspective, but to me, this applies to all of us. All right? This isn't just about what he has to do as a trained, ordained clergy person. All right? This is about what we're all called to do. And it's really just about getting to know the people around us and learning from them and developing those relationships so that we, again, can reflect the image of Christ to our neighbors. So let's watch the video.